All right, welcome to the fourth episode of my podcast, Talking's Not Dead. On today's episode, I brought on my friend Yogev to talk about Western Esotericism. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's essentially the history of practically done magic and the practices and, other customs that go along with it. It's a very interesting conversation. This one's a bit long, but I think it's definitely one of the most interesting conversations that I've had, so please stay tuned for the entire thing. I do want to remind everyone, as always, that no one in these videos is an expert on these topics, so please do not take everything that is said as an expert opinion or expert advice, okay? So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, thank you, Yogev, for coming on. So your topic is the history of magic. Now, to clarify, I want to make sure everyone's clear on this moving forward, because I'm going to be using magic and all those kinds of words. He's talking historical, not pop culture, not from stories. This is from like real world rituals and stuff. So my first question. Oh, sorry.
More accurately, the more accurate term might be Western Esotericism.
That's okay. That was what I was researching as well. So I'm glad that I got that correct. So I guess the question is, why did you choose that topic? What made you want to talk about it?
Well, because you asked me to find a topic that I can talk a lot about, but don't get the opportunity to.
Mm-hmm.
And this specific topic has been on my mind relatively recently. I just don't even know why it's been on my mind recently, but it has.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so weird and so obscure that I really just don't have the, like, when would I be able to talk about, like, Hermeticism and fucking Rosicrucians
right.
in my day-to-day.
Yeah, it never comes up, so I'm glad you have an opportunity to talk about it. So, I guess, just to start, if you wanted to summarize Western esotericism, am I saying that right? Esotericism?
Yeah, esotericism.
Esotericism. If you were to summarize that in as much or as little detail as you want, how would you summarize it for someone who's unfamiliar?
Ooh, okay. So it's the practice of magic in a it's the practice of magic in the real world. It's a series of primarily spiritual beliefs, although that are connected to many Western religious traditions, but not explicitly precisely a part of them. That has had, I think, a great deal of significance in the history of a lot of diverse fields of thought that all sort of come together with this notion of magic in its magic as a idea in, like, the human conscious. Like, magic is this very powerful idea that carries through. It's getting something for nothing, right? It's everyone kind of wants to do that.
How could you not, right?
Right? And there's a great deal of interest in figuring out how to. People have had a very, very strong interest in figuring out how to get things out of their spiritual beliefs.
Right. There's an incentive structure to that as well. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
You get a lot out of it if you were to do it, as well as the thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a lot of the people who have practiced these things have gotten a lot of things out of practicing and believing these things, both directly and indirectly from the practice. So it's very interesting to me.
Okay, well, I think that's a good summarization there. So I guess my first real question, I'm assuming that there was some start or early days of this, right? Maybe this is something that's been happening for as long as recorded history, but recorded history started at some point. In the early days, what are the sorts of things that people were doing? What were they trying to do, and how were they doing it?
Yeah. So this tradition really begins with I mean, it's as old as any religious belief.
Sure.
At a certain level, prayer is a form of magical practice,
Okay.
right? If you pray to whatever divine thing you worship, whether it's one god, many gods, whatever,
Hmm.
and you expect whatever you're praying to actually intervene in your life,
Hmm.
that is magic, right?
Right.
That you are trying to do.
Hmm.
And I don't want to like knock down anyone's personal religious or spiritual beliefs. I
Right.
don't happen to believe in any of this stuff, but um
Yeah, it's more of a
it's
definitional kind of thing. It's not necessarily
exactly.
knocking it. It's just
Yeah, actually, you want to talk about definitions? Magic is really fucking hard to define,
right.
specifically. A guy who I will be talking about, Aleister Crowley,
Hmm.
defined it as the application of the human will to achieve changes in the physical world,
Interesting.
which is a fine definition until you realize that a bunch of guys getting together, deciding to build a bridge, and then going and doing that
Is
falls under
also,
that
yeah.
definition.
Yeah. It
Um,
works
e-
kind of well if you don't think about normal applications.
exactly. Um, there's tons of definitions of magic out there. None of them work for all cases,
Right.
or they're so broad that everything is magic, right?
Which is interesting to me because I think and this is like a very philosophy of language kind of thing, but I think most people have a very intuitive sense of what magic is. They're like, oh yeah, if something was magic, I could identify what that is. But at the same time, when you sit down and you think about it, try to define it, it's a lot looser than it seems. It's not as tangible of a
It's
definition or a word.
yeah, it's extremely loose. But going back to your original question, how did this begin? So this specific tradition that I'm want to trace and talk about
Sure.
begins with it doesn't quite how does it it begins with Judaism
Hmm.
and begins with a specific certain things that are specific to Judaism as a religion as opposed to certain others.
Right.
The problem with Judaism is that there's only one book,
Okay.
and that Jews as a culture have had only this one book forever.
Right.
More or less. I mean, not literally forever, but for thousands and thousands of years,
Yeah.
it's just the Torah. There is the Talmud, which is like commentary on the Torah
Hmm.
through the centuries by different rabbis, but like it's just commentary on the one book that you have.
Right. It all goes back to
So
the one book.
yeah, so if you take this sort of religious tradition, and everyone has to dedicate their whole lives, everything they believe in is it's all related to this one book that they have. They start to do very weird things with that book.
Right.
And the weird thing that they do is what is called Kabbalah.
Okay.
So Kabbalah is it's sort of a broad esoteric practice within Judaism. It's way too broad a subject to like give you every bit of it.
Sure.
But
Absolutely.
a big part of Kabbalah is like reading the Torah and like assigning numbers to the individual words and doing math on those on those numbers
Interesting.
and using that math to uh whatever you want, predict things, divine new knowledge or information.
Okay.
um Yeah. And it goes eventually deeper into this concept of practical Kabbalah,
Hmm.
which is literally using being able to read the Torah so well that you can like do magic. Uh,
Okay. Interesting.
yeah. And so there are a lot of like Jewish myths and folklores that are related to this practical Kabbalah.
Hmm.
The myth of the golem is probably the most famous.
Interesting.
The Golem of Prague, or was it Prague? I think it was Prague. Might have been Krakow. One of these cities. I should know this off the top of my head. I don't
That's okay.
remember it. Um, Essentially, the Jewish community is being pogromed because that's just what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so a rabbi makes a figure out of clay
Mm-hmm.
and takes some pages from the Torah and puts it in its mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And this, the word of God, animates the golem, and the golem defends the community there.
Okay.
And this is sort of an example of what practical Kabbalah does.
I see. Okay.
Things of that nature. It's, yeah. Kabbalah, as we understand it today, begins in like the 13th century, all across Europe, but the like medieval Kabbalah descends from a tradition that dates back to at least the existence of the Second Temple in like 100 BC.
Right. Long history, long-standing tradition.
Exactly. And then that tradition descends from earlier traditions, right? It's these kinds of like early versions of this type of like magical or esoteric thought are very difficult to properly separate from just like religious belief, I would say. Because, like I said, the practical difference between praying to God for God to do something for you and doing a ritual in which you compel an angel to do something for you and and just like the magic being within you or whatever. These are, it's hard to, it's a continuum. It's not
it's not a hard divide.
Things.
Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, I think that's where it begins. I think Kabbalah is really where this tradition gets its origins from.
Okay. And was there any specific goal in mind, or was it more just, again, trying to, grace of God, or was there like a specific goal in mind with this? Because at least maybe naively, I kind of tend to think that like when you're doing magic, you have like an end goal, like you want to create X or you want to do Y. Normally, I just think that there's some kind of goal. Maybe that's naive, but I wasn't sure if there was.
Yeah. So the goal of magic in this sense has always been like, and if you talk to any practitioners of magic today, they will tell you that the goal is personal spiritual development.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So a lot of like modern practitioners of magic will relate what they're trying to do to themselves to these concepts from Buddhism.
Oh, okay.
So like in like a Buddhist belief, you have many lives, and you like try to like ascend to higher levels of enlightenment in each life, and try to like achieve the state of like perfect enlightenment of nirvana.
Right.
And there's different Buddhist sects that have different ideas of what that means, and yada yada yada. The goal of Western esotericism is to do that whole process in one go as quickly as possible.
Oh, okay. One-stop shopping. You're trying to get it done.
Exactly. It's a very Western idea. I would
yeah,
stress.
Actually, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Time is money. Let's get it done.
Yeah. And there's different versions of what this means, right? For a Jewish practitioner of Kabbalah, it means like unity with God,
sure.
In like spiritual sense. For Aleister Crowley and his the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, it means achieving a sun soul.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
And they have like all of these beliefs about what it is, and like all of these magical traditions say like, oh yeah, and you can use it to do XYZ thing,
sure,
practically in the world for sure, but don't focus on that.
Right. Right. The end goal is this one-stop shop enlightenment with the spirit, or the spiritualistic furtherment, if that makes that wording makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Development. That's what word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, no, you're totally fine. If you had something else you wanted to add, feel free to add.
No, let's go on to the next question.
Sure. So I guess so that kind of gets us kind of the beginning, right? So I guess my next
Hmm.
question is, were there so you talked about Judaism? Is that as a like a main uh
Yeah.
influence? Are there any other influences that kind of you can kind of be tied to this tradition? Are there any other inspirations, or is it mainly Judaism?
Yeah, no, there are tons. Another big one is if are you familiar with Gnosticism,
Yes.
the Gnostics?
Yes, I am actually.
Yeah. So yeah, the Gnostics play a huge role in and like they're even earlier than Kabbalah, but they're later than like the Merkaba, which is
Mm,
like the thing before Kabbalah. So like they're around the same time as like the Merkaba
okay.
ideas. Uh, the Gnostics. And the Gnostics, they believe some very interesting things
Right.
about like the nature of the physical world and
Hmm.
the very like they put like a very big emphasis on like the structure of divinity
Right.
and you know they believe that like you need to focus on spiritual enlightenment and this achieving gnosis,
Hmm.
right? In order to rather than like focusing on the material world,
Right.
right? And the Gnostics, so there's the Gnostics, right? You also have a lot of like, uh, I wouldn't say actual Greek and Egyptian like ancient beliefs,
Hmm.
but I would say like medievalist views on Greek and Egyptian mythology
Yeah, that's kind of hard to
plays.
avoid. Like they were so big, they spread out to a lot of different cultures. Like the question more is not whether or not there is Greek influence, but what kind of from what
Yeah,
lens of person did you get? Which books did they have access to? Because it wasn't all of them, I'll tell you.
yeah, exactly. So like after Kabbalah, the way that it like goes from just like a kind of weird belief within the Jewish community that's like, yeah, if you're like really obsessed with the Torah, we'll like give you these like math problems to deal with
Sure.
around it and like put you in a corner.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
Eventually the Christians find this.
Okay. All this is bound to happen in the story.
Yeah. And so these are the Hermeticists.
Hmm.
And so that word Hermeticism comes from their belief in this like sage like figure called I'm gonna get this wrong, so I'm gonna look at it. Hermes Trismegistus or
Okay.
Trimegistus, uh, which is like a mixture of their conception of the Greek god Hermes, the
Hmm.
Egyptian god Thoth,
Okay.
and like every historical philosopher they like.
Okay, okay. Makes sense. Gotta mix that all in there a little bit.
Yeah. And so it's like this grand sage figure.
Right.
And like the hermeticist beliefs are what like that's mainline esotericism. Like they
Hmm.
take this concept of Kabbalah and they adopt it to themselves because they kind of they basically like they take away the fact that it's like the Jewishness of it because they
Right.
didn't like the Jews very much.
Right.
But they were like, it's just old biblical knowledge.
Right, 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 right.
And
Now,
so
I guess one question, I don't know if you know the answer to this. So this is would this be like mainline Christianity, or would this be considered hereditary, like heretical in the time period?
that's yeah. Um it was often viewed as heretical at the time,
Hmm.
but at the same time, aspects of it were not.
Hmm.
Uh so the Hermeticists had a very interesting relationship with the church.
Hmm.
Um and they mostly got away with what they were doing because what they often did was cozy up to really powerful monarchs.
Okay, that makes sense.
Uh, so they would often get employed as astrologers or alchemists
Okay, that makes sense.
in like or physicians
Right,
often
right.
in like royal courts. So like the France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, these all had these like weird hermeticists
Right,
around the court
right.
and like their function in the court would be if the emperor wanted his astrological signs read, they would go over to the hermeticists who knew how to do that.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because what they were the magic that they were practicing combined these like spiritual beliefs, but also they were alchemy and like astrology were really big components of it. And so these people were very impressive to the like nobility of the times,
right?
Because they could do things that other people couldn't do. Like they could demonstrate their skills and capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, the for astrology, that required an incredible amount of mathematical knowledge, actually, because like to be able to often in their heads or just really quickly on paper figure out a person's date of birth or like time of birth and calculate the positions of the planets and the stars and everything in the sky at that time. Like they had actually a significant amount of what we would now call astronomical information.
Yeah, it's not like you can just look up online what your sign is and like figure out where the stars were, you know what I mean? You had to like do that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like you had to be a guy that like
you had to be a guy who could do it, and then, you know,
who could do it. Or like the alchemists or like the ones of them that practiced alchemy, and often they practiced multiple of these, right? Like you would very rarely just find an astrologer among the hermeticists. You would find an astrologer who also did alchemy, who also did like their own kind of weird theology stuff. And so like the alchemists were really interesting because are you familiar with how phosphorus was discovered?
Yes, that was from P, yeah?
Yeah, it was this alchemist who had this belief that he could distill urine and purify urine into gold.
Yep.
And he would
phosphorus
like go around.
Instead.
You go around town collecting people's urine and like scraping off like the salt from the top of it, and eventually it started glowing green because he discovered phosphorus.
Right.
Which like that was a new thing. That didn't exist before that, more or less, right?
And it was pretty useful, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was. You also had like early physicians were often hermeticists, right? There was this physician who was referred to as like Paracelsus, and like the teachings of Paracelsus were considered a form of magic.
Okay.
And like many modern medical symbols and symbology are hermeticist symbols. So are like the caduceus, the staff with the two serpents coiled around it.
Right.
In the hermeticist belief, that's the staff of Hermes Trismegistus.
Interesting. Okay.
Right?
I would not have guessed that. That's very interesting.
The pharmaceutical symbol, the RX, that is a simplified version of a symbol called the Eye of Horus, which is a hermeticist symbol.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because it's that looping R like shape with an X through it, and like the eye in the middle of the hole in the R. Yes. And that's a hermeticist symbol. Like it does date back to Egyptian mythology, but the reason that it is in the modern medical community is not because of the ancient Egyptians, it's because of the hermeticists. And yeah, so like you would have these like a guy would come into town, and he someone in your town would be sick, and he would come in and he would have like books he could read, and these books would be full of like weird esoteric symbols, and he would like concoct a strange brew concoction and give it to you, and you would feel better.
Right. Like that's impressive. That's impressive.
That's magic.
Yeah, okay.
As far as anyone's concerned at the time, that's magic.
Right. Like he was doing it.
Yeah, and he was practically speaking doing the thing. So that's another element of this that I kind of want to stress is that no one involved is like stupid.
Right.
The people practicing this magic are not stupid, and frankly, the people who believe that these people aren't stupid. They're like,
Yeah.
they don't have the same knowledge base that we would have today, and they're like seeing genuinely incredible things happening.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Based on these people's knowledge. So yeah, you would reasonably believe the other things that guy will start saying.
Right.
And when
You'll buy what he's selling.
As yeah, when he starts talking about other forms of magical practice, you're inclined to kind of believe him.
Why question him? He could do the other stuff, you know what I mean? Like, it makes sense. Very historic, like, it makes total sense.
Yeah. So going back to your concept of back to your original question with like how the church felt about these people. The church made a distinction, like a practical distinction between what it called white magic and black magic.
Interesting. Okay.
And black magic is sorcery, is witchcraft, is the thing the church is like explicitly killing people for.
Right.
But like astrology, alchemy, like the medical practice,
right,
and this other thing called theurgy that they would do, which was like this idea of invoking angels to do things in the physical world.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Those were all considered white magic, and they were more or less fine,
right,
depending on how zealous the particular local church was.
Okay, that's fair. And I was also going to mention, it makes sense to me that a lot of these guys would snuggle up to monarchs, especially probably in that time period, because this is before the church had more power than the monarchy in general. I mean, there was a flip of power eventually. So even if they
actually flipped multiple, I would say it flipped multiple times
fair.
in different areas.
Yes, that's fair. Absolutely. Depending on where you're at, you're looking at absolutely.
Yeah. And a lot of these guys moved around. Mm-hmm. One very famous, very influential one, kind of in the later end of this time period, is a guy by the name of John Dee. And he was the court astrologer and alchemist for Queen Elizabeth's court.
Okay.
So this is like 1500s.
Right.
And yeah, at several points, he is like kicked out of England because like different religious views become more or less strong, right? And he like wanders around the continent for a while. He like goes into, I think it was Emperor Maximilian the First's court for a time in the Holy Roman Empire. He buddies up with this one guy for a while who practices something they called scrying, which was this practice at the time where people would claim to like look into orbs or like mirrors and such, and like angels would tell them things through them. And so the things that the angels would tell this guy were often very interesting. For one, there's this one case where he and John Dee are like holed up in a house at one point, and this guy is like practicing scrying, and he is told by the angels that he and John Dee should fuck each other's wives.
Oh my god.
So that's an element of it. Is a lot of these people are just like in it for themselves. Like, a lot of these people are what we would call grifters today.
Right. Yeah, there was like a Ponzi scheme.
Not all of them. No. Yeah, but a lot of them. And John Dee is an especially interesting figure because about 100 years later, you have a guy by the name of Sir Isaac Newton.
Right.
And Newton was also a practicing alchemist.
Absolutely, he was interested in a variety of different things.
Yeah,
he's nowadays remembered for his science, but that was probably, even you can argue, not his primary focus, even close.
Not exactly. And frankly, he probably considered his science and his mathematics to be a part of his like Hermeticist beliefs.
Yeah.
And one of the most famous quotes from Sir Isaac Newton is, "If I have seen far, it is because I stand upon the shoulders of giants."
Yes.
John Dee is one of the giants he's talking about.
Right. Yeah.
So the tradition persists forward, and like Newton, this is like the beginnings of what we would now call modern science.
Yes, he was like the forefather for in many aspects, I would say.
Exactly. And so, yeah, like the magical tradition permeates forwards through history in very interesting ways. It permeates through through like modern science. Alchemy eventually becomes chemistry.
Yep.
this like medical magic eventually becomes modern medicine.
Yeah.
This the old astrologists eventually become guys like Galileo,
Right.
right? It all I don't think there's this. I think there's an impulse today to like look at like the what we would like the early stages of like modern science
Mm-hmm.
and imagine it kind of came out of nothing,
Right.
and just
Definitely
like
no.
but it didn't. And people at the time would not have considered them much different from the wizards walking
No.
around.
Yeah. Definitely. So actually, this is actually a really good point for my next question. So I was going to ask you. So throughout like history, like what were some of the major changes that happened? Like what was something that and what stayed the same throughout the entirety of history? So maybe you don't have to go through everything, but some of the big milestones. What would you say changed and what stayed the same for
In like the magical practice.
magical practice? The beliefs as a whole for Western esotericism. Like what would you say?
I think. Okay, so secret societies started to become very significant to this practice. Like earlier on, it is kind of free form out in the open. You have this like few books related to Hermeticism floating around, and people read them and then come up with their own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Until eventually you get this and in like the 1500s, a series of pamphlets get printed describing whatever a group of people referred to as the Holy Order of the Rosy Cross. I think they were called.
Okay.
What I will now be calling the Rosicrucians.
Okay.
And these people, these Rosicrucians, were supposedly these like very highly placed in like the church and in like the royal courts and like whatever institutions of power there were at the time. These like learned and capable men who would practice alchemy and
Right.
all these things and like achieved true spiritual enlightenment and would eventually bring themselves out in the open and usher humanity to create heaven on earth.
Right.
Now, the Rosicrucian pamphlets were a hoax. There were no Rosicrucians when the pamphlets were printed.
Interesting.
100 years later, there were Rosicrucians.
Okay.
There were these secret societies of these people who would like look at these pamphlets and were like, "This is a good idea. We should do this."
That's so funny. It's like they
so
created the thing they were talking about.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the Rosicrucians, become like these Rosicrucian orders start to become repositories of these like Hermeticist beliefs as like Protestantism and like modernity start to creep in. And one of the things is like as Protestantism, as capitalism, as like these beliefs that are completely form the modern world, they didn't really have much place for a lot of these Hermeticist beliefs. And so they often got kind of tossed aside, but they were preserved within these like Rosicrucian orders.
I see. Okay.
And these Rosicrucian orders don't strictly die out, but they kind of die out until the turn of the 20th century. So like the very end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century, with a bunch of really weird British scholars who form what's called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Okay.
And you can't understand Western esotericism in the modern era without understanding the Golden Dawn. Because the Golden Dawn really cemented a bunch of beliefs that then would go on to a few people, notable people, Aleister Crowley, and one other guy whose name I forget. Like they wrote books after the Golden Dawn had like dissolved, and they like spread the beliefs about it, and founded a couple of religions, and
You know.
so like modern Wicca,
Mhm.
like the Wiccan beliefs, which is like a real religion today, but it's a modern religion. It was only created in the last like 70, 80 years.
Mhm.
Uh, Wiccans practice magic,
Right.
and their practice of magic is almost dot for dot what Aleister Crowley was writing about.
Interesting.
Aleister
Okay.
Crowley himself founded a religion called Thelema, which is also involved in practice of magic, and Thelema also has modern followers and modern believers. And like a lot of like the New Age movement descends from a lot of these beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you have to understand the Golden Dawn, and the Golden Dawn is wild because it only exists for about 16 years.
Okay.
It like is founded in like 1894, 1895, and it dissolves before 1910.
Okay. So pretty quick.
So it's very
Snapshot in
very
history.
short-lived. Very short-lived, very weird history, a lot of like internal power struggles,
Okay.
a lot of like well-to-do like people of British high society. Ooh, we're gonna do magic. And it is a real shame that that is where the tradition. It's either a real shame or the most appropriate thing ever. That is where that tradition ended up.
Right.
Was with these people.
You can decide for yourselves.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'll talk about deciphering the story for how the story that the people who founded the the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, I should say. The story they tell of how it was founded is very interesting.
Okay.
And I think it gives a good like example of the kind of mindsets these people are in.
Sure.
So, as the story goes, these four guys with the most British ass names ever, who I can never remember, and
That's
I won't
okay.
even attempt to.
That's okay.
One of them is trolling an old used bookstore when he comes across a like 80 some page manuscript written entirely in code.
Okay.
This is referred to as the cipher manuscript.
Okay.
And is very important to the history of the Esoteric Order, of the Hermetic Order, I should say. So this guy gives it to his friend who is interested in like cryptography.
Right.
And he spends like a year deciphering this manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And this manuscript purports to like have been written in like 1806.
Okay.
And is like describing one of these like the structure and like rituals of one of these Rosicrucian orders.
Okay.
And so these guys who are like who found the Hermetic Order, they get together, they look at these manuscripts, and they're like, awesome, we're gonna set up our own secret society, our own lodge, based off of this document that we found. It gets weirder.
Okay.
There is one page of these manuscripts that talks about a German woman that was a part of one of these Rosicrucian orders, and so they write her a letter, and she like responds, and they claim that she like inducts them into this Rosicrucian order, and so that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn actually does descend. Is like they're trying to liken it back to the traditions.
Right.
That page has been proven to be a forgery. No other page of the document is a proven forgery, but that one is.
So it's proven that they forged that specific detail so that they could seem to be more legit by someone.
Mm-hmm. And the letters to this woman, there is no evidence this woman ever actually existed.
Oh my god.
Um, uh,
That is
it's very
so
weird.
funny.
It's especially weird because the whole cipher manuscript is really strange because it's dated to 1806. This very specific date, because in the cipher manuscript there is there's a discussion of some like ancient Egyptian things that were known in the 1890s,
But not
because the Rosetta Stone had been translated by then.
Okay, interesting.
But it wasn't translated until the 1820s.
I see.
So this document wasn't all a forgery, but probably wasn't actually written when it was claimed to have been written.
Right.
It's a very weird thing.
Has it been confirmed that this dude did find it like in an old like bookstore? Like, is that part of the story confirmed, or is that like not, no one can know kind of thing?
No one can really know.
Mm-hmm.
It seems unlikely that he just wrote the whole thing himself.
Okay.
There is evidence to suggest that he did not.
Okay.
About it.
That's fair.
But there is also, like I said, evidence that the story that is being told about it is not strictly true.
Right.
And so that's sort of the vibe of the
Right.
Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
I now understand the vibe. I've gathered it.
Yeah. Oh god. No. And they're the things that they like their practice, like I said, it's very interesting. They oh god, it gets even weirder. So the document also describes these like what are referred to as the secret elders.
Okay.
Which are like supposedly these semi like quasi-spiritual people. Like, it's unclear whether they're supposed to actually be real people or like angels or something equivalent. But the idea is that like the order was supposedly blessed by these secret elders, and it like has the blessing of the secret elders and therefore was allowed to exist. It's like this desperate, there's like a desperation to give themselves like legitimacy by tying themselves back to like to these things.
They really want to be rooted in some sort of like tradition or something that gives them like authority on these matters, and like seems like there's like a vacuum almost in a sense.
Oh yeah, no, they're exactly. So yeah, and they, as you would go through the induction of the Hermetic Order, there would be like tiers and levels that you have to progress through, and you would like learn different things at each of these levels. So like at a certain level, they're just sort of teaching you like the base spiritual beliefs, maybe a little bit of astrology. That's about it. At a higher level, you're starting to learn alchemy, you're starting to learn like how to elevate your soul, you're learning you're starting to learn like theurgy. They have all of these like a lot of they're taking a lot of beliefs from a lot of different places. There's this you may have heard the term "as above, so below." This is like a big part of the like esoteric tradition in general, and it's because it's a big part of the Hermetic Order's tradition, and it's this idea of like you make a change on a small scale and it affects change on a large scale, and vice versa, right?
Okay.
Because it's not as above, so below, but it's the actual, because it's in Latin, and it's quod est superius est sicut quod inferius et quod inferius et sicut quod est superius. As above, so below, and as below, so above.
I see. Okay, so there's a bit, you're missing half of the quote there.
Yeah, and it's this idea of like, how does this like practical magic happen? Because that's kind of the selling factor, right?
Right.
Once once you're in the whole spiritual belief system, you can focus on like elevating your soul on these like
Right,
tiers
right.
of high, like, these tiers, which is the thing that you kind of have to focus on, because sadly you can't actually, shoot fire out of your hands or whatever.
Unfortunately. So yet to be
um
proven.
yeah, but there still has to be this magical element, and it's very interesting. It's they do these like rituals, which will involve like basically any form of like occult, vaguely occult thing you may have heard of. These people were actually doing.
Right.
So they were like drawing out diagrammatic pentagrams and circles and lighting candles,
Mm-hmm.
and like spilling drops of their own blood onto
Okay, yeah.
like things simple, like pieces of bread to symbolize like a kind of like the Eucharist, and then like eating them. Um, there'd be these like chants, and often in Latin, to like trying to invoke whatever thing you're trying to create into the world,
Right.
um
Stoke the fires of change.
yeah. And so eventually, about 16 years into the whole process, the Hermetic Order collapses in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge falling out between various members. Aleister Crowley writes like a tell-all book about
Oh my
what was
god!
happening.
He did not! Oh my god!
He absolutely did. Um, it's like, actually his book and a later book by another former member are like most of the practical information of like what they actually believed.
That's hilarious.
Comes from. And it breaks up. Interestingly enough, there are two organizations today that claim to be still the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Okay.
Both in America.
Of course.
Because like a lodge was a lodge was made in America, like a satellite lodge for the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when the British original lodges like collapsed, the American lodges stuck around for like another 20 years.
Okay.
And like the people from them kind of split up their own ways, and like some of them recreated them. So there is like a registered corporation in Florida today that is Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn Incorporated.
Oh my god. That's amazing.
It is beautiful.
That is beautiful.
So yeah. And then so their beliefs from the Golden Order, the Hermetic Order, sorry. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, spread throughout the world from these books, and like these like New Age religions start coming about, and they start taking these ideas and applying them. And like these ideas, I think they're more potent and like more prevalent than people like to imagine they are.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with The Secret?
The Secret? No, I don't think I am.
It's relatively recent. Like it's a book that was published not like in the last 20-30 years.
Okay.
That talks about this like idea of manifesting, so affecting change in the world by willing it into being. Okay. And you do this manifesting practice by like you will like draw pictures of the thing you want to create, and you will like speak verbal aphorisms towards it, and like
sounds a lot.
You're essentially doing you're doing every individual step of this process of these processes that Aleister Crowley laid out, and in the same way that like the esotericists, you can do all this like real magical shit, but we're not really focusing on that. This manifesting practice, this manifesting idea, focuses on like changes in yourself and like the things you can do. But
Right.
also, if you wanted to like manifest getting a new job or
Right. Here's how you would do
finding a lot
that.
of money or whatever, that's
Yeah.
part of it.
Okay.
And like
It's a side part.
The Secret was like a best-selling book. It like tons of people today genuinely believe in this stuff.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked deeply into the author of The Secret to
Mhm.
precisely. I can't tell you for a fact that the author of The Secret read Aleister Crowley's books
But
and is following it, more or less follows his teachings. But I'm pretty sure
yeah,
that is where that comes from.
he caught wind of it somehow.
Yeah. Uh. So yeah, I think that's if we want to talk about like the historical progression that takes you to today.
Yeah.
And yeah, I want to stress that these things are very much so still around.
So I have a few more questions. I think you covered
Yeah.
a lot of ground. So a few of these questions we kind of already covered, so we can kind of breeze past them if you feel like it. But I already kind of predicted that alchemy would come up in this conversation. So I wanted to just ask you, how is alchemy different from these other traditions, and what are the influences that alchemy has had on these traditions? But we've already spoken about alchemy a fair amount, but it's up to you if you have anything else you want to say on the matter.
Yeah. So alchemy is interesting because it's not. I think the key thing about alchemy is how a part of these traditions it is.
Mm-hmm.
How alchemy as can't be meaningfully separated from the religion, the astrology
Mm-hmm.
elements of it. Like the alchemists assigned individual metals
Mm-hmm.
to the planets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason that Mercury is called Mercury
Right.
is because it was called Quicksilver at the time, but it was associated with the planet Mercury.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Um, Things of that nature. I think um, whatever. Like Newton did a bunch of alchemy, and like one of the things that he created was a structure that he referred to as the net, which was related to like his interpretation of a particular Greek myth.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the Greek mythology really influenced like the Hermeticists.
Right.
So I think alchemy we like to imagine it as its own like individualized tradition
Mm-hmm.
or as like proto chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it really can't be separated meaningfully from the rest of the esoteric
Okay.
beliefs.
So it would be more of like a discipline within the esoteric beliefs as opposed to its own
Yeah,
separate discipline.
absolutely. If you look at like in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they consider there to be three kinds of magical practice: alchemy, astrology, theurgy.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's throughout the whole process. It's deep. Alchemy is a deep part of it because, like I said, magic is trying to get something for nothing,
Mm-hmm.
and the core thing you want to get from alchemy is to turn lead into gold, turn impure metals into precious
Which
metals,
almost
right?
every person has ever tried to do that. Newton tried to do that. You know what I mean? Like that was like
Yeah,
everyone's tried it. That was one a big one.
exactly. Um, yeah.
Um. So we talked a little bit about like the church's view on this stuff, and you kind of talked about like the everyday person like kind of believing this stuff. But like, I guess maybe my first question before I ask these rest of the questions, would you say that not necessarily in terms of people's beliefs, but as like a society, do you think that people, like a society, I should say, generally doesn't believe in these things as much anymore, or do you think that it's similar, or how would you see that on like a societal level, not like an
Um,
individual level?
yeah. So I think on a societal level, there is less belief in magic
Mhm.
as the technologies of modernity became more prevalent.
Mhm.
And I don't just mean like the technologies as like the what we would consider technology today, like your phone or whatever.
Sure.
But like also like ideology is a kind of technology,
Right.
right? So, capitalism dissolving social beliefs of all kinds, including magical beliefs.
Mhm.
And like more dour forms of Protestantism where
Right.
they would consider like as the modern world like modernity. You also, as modernity comes to be, you also have things like the witch trials, which
Mhm.
begin to make magic considered to be makes like magic that would have previously been considered like for various folk practices
Right.
mixed with these like white magic stuff. Now suddenly all magic is just demons
Yeah.
and like evil and to be destroyed.
Yeah, and it gets pushed to the fringes of society if it survives.
Exactly. And then I think where magic has resurged in the modern times, and I think it genuinely has resurged. Like I think it was very much so underground when it was these like weird Rosicrucian lodges and like
Mhm.
the Hermetic Order. Eventually, right? It it got a resurgence in the modern times as like as religious beliefs started to decline.
Mhm.
If you look at today, like irreligiosity is increasing all throughout the world.
Right.
Uh, but I think people still need some kind of most people still need some kind of spiritual beliefs,
Right.
and magic as this idea of like getting something for nothing, but also personal spiritual development really gels well with the modern world,
Right.
with
It
like the
does.
modern subject.
Right.
Uh
Your chakras, your astrology
yeah,
is
and
spinning
then
again.
now you have all these and the people who like talked about magic started to take all these Eastern traditions that they hadn't previously been exposed to
Mhm.
and bastardize them as much as they bastardized the Egyptians and Greeks of
Right.
yesteryear.
Right.
And it's also why I'm not from any of those cultures, so I don't want to speak on like,
Sure.
but like they had their own versions of alchemy, their own versions of folk magic, their own sort of
So
their own things.
I'm actually curious because this is actually just something I'm thinking of. So we spoke a lot earlier about how there's a lot of religious influence on the various different esotericism and like the beliefs that are associated with that and like the practices. But what it
Yeah,
almost sounds like you're saying is that in the modern world, to kind of like go along with the spike in lack of religious beliefs, you've had this almost like secular magic that has become popularized, where there's not any necessarily like one religious belief associated with it, but there's the spiritual practice, the trying to there's the rituals, the bettering oneself. That's all there without any specific religious like ties.
yeah, exactly. Because at a certain level, the real difference between those two is almost you can almost think of it as like religion can only really exist in community,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But as like modernity and like modern capitalism dissolves communal ties, you're only really left with yourself,
Right.
and you need a spiritual practice that is just all about developing the self.
Right.
And magic really really does that.
Yeah.
That's esotericism really. That's all esotericism is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Because it started with these like weirdo. Frankly, it started with these really weird loner practitioners of Kabbalah in these Jewish communities
Right.
almost
Right.
2 years ago.
Right. It's like poetry. It rhymes.
Exactly.
um. So I think you've already answered it. But so would you say then? So besides the modern spike, would you say that in the more relative modern times, the dip in the tradition? Would you say that's due to capitalism, or would you say there's any other causes that have kind of that caused it to kind of become less popular, then resurge a little bit in a new form now?
I would say I would blame capitalism for it. But I think it's not just capitalism, but it's also the Reformation. I think plays a big role. Because the Protestant Reformation takes what the whole concept of the Protestant Reformation was to personalize and individualize your belief in God, right? To take the church, to turn the church from a like singular, broad, powerful social institution of community, and turn it into a bunch of like small, atomized local churches, and you're reading your own Bible, and you're coming to your own conclusions, and you're taking these Protestant beliefs, and then you're engaging in the capitalist market with them. So I think the dip is because there wasn't a need for magic in a certain sense.
I see.
Because you could just now you could just be a doctor. Right. Now you could just be a scientist. Now you can just be weirdo crank who is ranting about the angels.
The roles in society that it kind of took up had other things fill its place, almost.
Exactly. And I think it was a combination of like, I think it was probably more to do with the Reformation technically than capitalism, but I don't think the Reformation and capitalism and the development of capitalism are so interwoven with one another that it's impossible to separate the two.
That's fair. So I guess this is maybe a bit of a loaded question. So I'm not sure how to word this one. So I'm gonna try my best. But so we talked a lot about if you're a layperson, you see this person doing things that look like magic. You have the alchemy, you have the medical practices, and all that. And they obviously it looks like magic, so you believe the other guy. But for the people practicing it, right? Like, this has been practiced for many, many, many years, right? Hundreds of thousands of years, right? Or not hundreds of thousands, hundreds/thousands of years. Like, for some of their goals, like, for example, like turning like, like regular metal into precious metal, for whatever, like turning lead into gold, like it never worked. They could never do it. So like how did the lack of success in some of these bigger projects, or like the grandiose like claims, how did that never stop these people? Or like what caused it to continue despite the lack of success?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I have a firm answer for you there.
That's fair.
What I think though is so it's a process of seeking knowledge, of seeking enlightenment, of developing, right? So I think it hasn't worked yet because I'm not there yet.
I see. Okay.
And perhaps I will never be there, but my student might. His student might.
I see.
Right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So it's like, it's more of like the spiritual development. What the lack of success has to be coming from me in some sense, right? And maybe I'm never going to be ready, but someone in the future could be ready, so I need to continue my work. Yeah.
Like in Kabbalah, practical Kabbalah, like the part that we would call like doing magic, you can kind of do it, but you're not supposed to do it.
I see.
You're actually not supposed to do practical Kabbalah until the third temple is built. Until the Messianic age.
Okay.
Right? It's this idea of like, we can kind of do this, but the world is not ready for us to be able to do this quite yet. So we need to work to get ourselves to that stage. Right? And I think that element of it, that, we can kind of do this practical stuff, and just enough to like convince people mostly. But you should probably not focus too much on that and focus more on getting us to the point where we can now do it.
Which,
right?
Which sounds like a theme from our conversation, which is like all these things that, you know, maybe modern people might think of as magic, like the big things, sound like we're not as maybe big of a focus in the tradition itself. There's a lot of like self-improvement, spiritual like progression that seem to be more of a focus, at least in the traditions themselves.
Yeah, which is probably mostly because it didn't work, right?
Right,
You
right.
couldn't actually make lead into gold. You couldn't
Right.
actually breathe life into people,
Right.
right?
That makes sense. Yeah, you're focused on what you can do.
Yeah. And but the thing is, what I find very interesting is these traditions did shape these like monumental institutions of the modern world,
Right.
modern medicine, modern science.
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, we can turn lead into gold now.
Yeah.
We know how to do that.
Yeah.
Bombard it with enough, with a powerful enough neutron ray,
Yeah.
and yeah, your lead will become gold.
Yes.
Like we can do a lot of the things that these magical traditions were trying to do.
Which I think is why, is interesting is like there's that quote where it's like any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. You know what I mean? It's like as technology advances, a lot of the things that magic claimed to want to be able to do, it's like we can do it and then some sometimes. So it's interesting to think about that.
Are you familiar with the corollary to that quote? Any sufficiently well understood magic is indistinguishable from science.
Interesting. Okay, I've never heard that one. That's very good. I like that. That's cool.
Interesting. And yeah, I think that's at the end of the day, they did, you know, apply their will and change the world.
They did. I mean, it's hard to argue, especially with a lot of things you've laid out. Like a lot of these beliefs and traditions have shaped how we live our lives today and institutions today in ways that many people will never even know. They won't even know it even existed, and that it affects how they do things.
Exactly.
Talking about influences, now I know you and I talked about this beforehand, and so I'm not sure if you got a chance to think about it or not, but I did want to ask, and so if you don't have a great answer, that's okay. What do you think has been like the influence on like pop culture magic from like, you know, real life Western esotericism? Like, you know, in pop culture, it's a very specific style, and I think it hasn't been around for very long. So have there been any influences from that you can think of? Is it all like, is it disjointed? What do you think?
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that there are definitely aesthetic elements of the esoteric traditions that are understood to be shorthands for magic, and therefore will show up in stories.
Okay.
So, like, look at any sort of media where there are wizards, and they will often draw diagrams on the floor. They will often light candles. They will often do these practices of changing something small to change something large.
Right.
These like this. There is certainly an aesthetic understanding of what magic looks like to us that does definitely stem specifically from the esoteric order of from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Sorry,
right.
Not the esoteric, the Hermetic Order. So there's that. I think also yeah, a lot of elements like that. There's a big emphasis in the in like hermeticist orders on like passing down your knowledge to a specific student, not like teaching like as a classroom, but like individualized passing down. And I think that is often a big element of how we think about like wizards in media, things like that, right? Even to the extent that like there are obviously like very famous exceptions to that rule. Harry Potter is probably the most
Right.
famous of them, right? Where it's literally like a school, kind of anathema to those magical traditions,
Right.
actually, to teach it in that context, in that setting.
Right. Right.
Uh, so obviously it's not universal.
No. Do you I'm thinking out loud here. Do you think that like the rise in like magical pop culture, right? I would say that there's a lot of like it's a lot bigger now, but even, I would say it was still fairly more popular than it ever had been. Do you think that that comes from like again that lack of, actual magic being involved in people's lives? Do you think that that filled a bit of a void, or you think it's unrelated?
I absolutely think it's related. I think that because right, fantasy literature more or less begins with Tolkien,
Right.
right? Like there are kind of examples that are pre-Tolkien, but very few, and they're kind of ill-formed, as we would consider them today.
Yeah, it wasn't until Tolkien that there was like a baseline, and then people tried to almost emulate that in a sense. Like people, we haven't even gotten away from it, even today. I would say.
Yeah, we are still living in the fantasy genre Tolkien penned.
Right.
Um, and yeah, like fantasy. And think about when Tolkien was writing and when Tolkien was getting popular was like the post-war years,
Mm-hmm.
uh, where like you know, uh, at least in the West, right, where capitalism has like violently overthrown all opposition and stands, peak of top of the world.
Right.
Um, and at the same time, this is when the like collapse of where the like decline of religiosity is like really starting to become apparent.
Right.
And yeah, I think our collective love of fantasy literature, well, not everyone loves it, but I
Sure.
do. Uh,
You and me.
I think I think it in part does come from the fact that I'm fairly sure this is true about you. It's definitely true about me. I am not a religious person. I am an
Yeah.
atheist, and I've never been religious.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think we don't have magic in our lives in that sense, so
Right.
we find magic where we can get it.
That's fair. Yeah, I would probably agree with that.
Because, like I said, magic is a very potent force in the human psyche,
Yeah.
and
Hard to get away from.
I don't even think it's healthy to get away from it.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay, last real question that I have. Do you have any like fun facts or like bits of information that you wanted to just share? Anything that you really wanted to tell us?
I shared a lot of them already.
Mm-hmm. I figured you did, but I want to make sure if there's any that we missed, you got a chance. And if there's not, that's
Yeah.
totally okay.
Um. Not off the top of my head. I've shared a lot of my fun facts.
Okay.
As we've gone along. Um. Yeah, people believe very interesting things,
They
and
do.
it's always very fascinating to me.
I definitely think this has been super fascinating. Well, Yogev, thank you for coming on.
Of course. I had a reputation on this podcast apparently, and
You
so
did.
I needed to come with my best.
Yeah, I think you brought it. I think you brought your best.